Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our House District 2024 Democratic primary debate. Thank you to everyone here at the Salt Lake City Library downtown, and to everyone joining us online. As you've been told, my name is McKenzie Romero, editor of Utah News Dispatch. Our new nonprofit news outlet here in the state is part of the National States Newsroom network focused on policy and government reporting across the country. Tonight, we're taking an opportunity to get to know the Democrats running to represent Utahns living in the heart of Salt Lake City, to ask them about some of the most pressing issues in our state. And I admire them for running for office in a particularly interesting political year. And I appreciate all of you for tuning in, for informing yourselves, for engaging in the civics in our state, and for wanting to be informed as you go to the polls later this month. We'll begin with candidate introductions, our order was decided in a coin toss earlier. Our incumbent, Representative Joel Briscoe, won that coin toss and was elected to go first. So we'll let each candidate introduce themselves before we move into some of the questions we prepared for tonight.
Thank you, McKenzie. This audience here and online warmed specific teachers' heart. This is the way I taught my students it's supposed to happen. I told them at the end of my civics class, I expect you to be registered to vote. I expect you to pay attention to current events. I expect you to combine those two and vote. And then I expect you to do something good for your community. That was Mr. Briscoe's dream. I am a retired high school history teacher. And I think a lot of this time about my father, who was a teacher, who taught in the high school system, the public system in Utah, and who taught at Westminster College. I come from a long line of teachers on both sides of the family. So it was like, I've got a brother and sister sitting in the audience who were both recently retired teachers. There have been teachers on my mother's side of the family or my father's side of the family since the 1930s, going on 100 years. I learned a lot from Dad. I learned about public service. He served 3 terms on the school board in Davis County. I learned from Mom and Dad about how to care, how to love, how to be passionate about justice, and how to fight for it. I'm thinking about something today I haven't thought of in years. At one point, toward the end of the Vietnam War, Life magazine, we had a lot of reading material in our house. Life magazine published the pictures of 217 U.S. soldiers who died in Vietnam in 1 week. 242 died, but some parents didn't give permission for their sons' pictures to appear in the magazine. I flipped through it. I was sitting on the couch doing who knows what. My father was at one end of the room reading the magazine. He's an Army, he was an Air Force vet. And I remember the tears rolling down his face. Copious tears running down his face as he flipped through Life magazine, looking at all those young lives, 242 lives, 217 pictures lost. We are debating in perilous times. I'm serving in a legislature representing District 24, where the public education system is under attack, where it's being systematically weakened, perhaps one day to be dismantled. We're in a country where we're talking about authoritarian rule and where democracy is under attack. We're sitting in a state where we won't talk about climate change, even though we will talk about the Great Salt Lake and the drought, and we'll talk about the Colorado River. But we won't talk about the real things that really matter. I'm happy that we're going to be answering questions that have been submitted from ideas that we've given. I look forward to this debate, to this give and take. Happy that you're all here, glad to be here with Grant, with Better Utah Institute and McKenzie. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Grant Umjud Miller. I'm a public defender. I became a public defender to help people in vulnerable situations. And I'm running for the Utah State House for the exact same reason. My top campaign priorities are compassionate solutions for our unsheltered, access to reproductive health care, and criminal justice reform. Before I begin, I want to tell you a little bit about me, where I come from. I come from a little bit of a weird background. My dad is from Wisconsin. My mother was here. She's from Palestine and the occupied West Bank. She was born in Jerusalem. She was born in Bethlehem, grew up in Jerusalem. And she came to the United States because of the war, because of the conflict. My family moved to Salt Lake City, to a bungalow on Bryant Avenue, not far from here, when I was 1 year old. Growing up, my mom taught me the importance of service. Coming from a place where often the only people that you have to look after each other are each other. The importance of service and having compassion. And the truth that to have real compassion takes courage. So she encouraged me to get involved in service. My maternal grandfather, before he passed away, he said, "Don't just sit around and talk about change. Get into the system and be that change." And that's how I find myself before you today. It's taken me through a journey through law school. I've been practicing law for about 7 years. The majority of my career has been as a court-appointed attorney, where I've helped people in very difficult circumstances. And I've dealt professionally with adversaries in very difficult situations. I carry a unique skill set that I'm hoping will directly translate to the Utah State House of Representatives, to be effective, to bring meaningful solutions and a fresh energy in this marathon of bringing progressive values back into this space. Once again, my name is Grant Umjed Miller, and I look forward to this discourse and speaking with you today.
Thank you. We're going to start out a little easy, just grease the wheels, and we'll start here with you, Grant. Talk about your leadership style, how that leadership style would make you an effective legislator and help you advocate for your constituents in the priorities that you have.
Thank you. I think leadership is probably the foremost attribute that you have to take in when evaluating a candidate to represent you. For me, I believe that you need to lead from the ground, from the trenches, from the people that you are trying to help. I've been a public defender now for close to 7 years, and not only have I had extensive courtroom experience and experience with social workers in our unsheltered community, I also have been on the board of the Liberty Wells Community Council for several years. And whenever I can, I try to attend every community council meeting across the district. It's important to know exactly what's going on. You can't helicopter around and assume what people need. You need to talk to people. You need to be engaged. If you don't go to community council meetings, you don't know the specific needs of each community. You don't know that in Ballpark, for example, on Jefferson, Washington Street, there's nowhere to park. If you're not engaged in Liberty Wells, for example, you don't know how the closure of Hawthorne Elementary School has put everyone in fear of not having a local green space for their kids to be at. These are the kind of localized issues that leaders should take into account, because good leaders lead from the ground, lead with the people that they're representing. And that's a value I will bring up to the state legislature.
Thank you. Representative Briscoe, your leadership style, how that would play for you?
I've been the president of my local teachers union in Davis County. I was the president of the Salt Lake City School Board. You don't get to these positions unless the people that you serve with have faith and confidence in you. You don't get to these positions unless the voters elect you. When you get to positions like this, it's a neighborhood by neighborhood thing. It's what's going on here, there, and otherwise. I'm working with people in the Ballpark Community Council area who have concerns about some of the patterns of businesses in their area. I'm also doing some research on schooling that a parent who's leaving the Hawthorne system has brought to me that I promised I would find out for her. My peers have helped selected me to be one of the co-chairs of the Bipartisan Legislative Clean Air Caucus at the Utah House of Representatives. And you gotta listen, you gotta serve, and you gotta act. Thank you.
Thank you. So now let's talk about the elephant in the room. It is highly likely that as a Democrat in the Utah House of Representatives, you will be in a super minority. How will you get things done? How will you work with Republicans, and how will you represent your constituents in that environment? We'll start with Representative Briscoe.
I got legislation passed. If you know any 17-year-old is going to be 18 by November 5th, if you get them to register, please, they can vote in the primary election. When I brought that piece of legislation to the House committee, I had Adam Gardner, who was an elected Salt Lake County Republican official, and I had the head of the Democratic Party of the state of Utah on the other side. I said, this is not a partisan issue. This is about getting young people more involved in politics. I think I had 15 no votes in the House and 0 no votes in the Senate. It passed unanimously. You can't do that with every bill. That won't happen with every bill. There are bills that won't get out of rules. My bill to require every student next year who receives up to $8,000 to homeschool or to go to a private school with tax dollars, up to $82 million the state's going to spend. I've run legislation to say those kids should take the same tests that the kids in public schools take at the end of the school year. They wouldn't let it have a hearing. They didn't want it to have a hearing. They didn't want to talk about it. I mean, you make relationships, you try and use language that you can move your things a little bit further along. Sometimes I feel like one of the justices on the Supreme Court, and I'm writing a minority opinion that I hope someone will take up in a few years from now when I may or may not be around. But someone will say, you know what, Briscoe was right. That's where we should go, and that's where we should move. You have to engage with people. You also have to love your issues and be passionate and pushing forth your values.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, how will you work as a Democrat in a Republican legislature?
I appreciate the question because it feels very helpless sometimes when the cards are almost completely stacked against you. As a public defender, I'm used to that. I have to go into a courtroom with a prosecutor who I don't usually agree with and a judge that I don't agree with. And they both carry a lot more power than I do. And somehow I have to navigate this system and find some resolution for the person that I represent that's acceptable. And it feels next to impossible, but I've been able to do it every time I've gone to court. And I've been able to establish it in the legislature. I want to do it more. Last year I helped work on a bill called HB 234. But what it did is it helped streamline petitions for gender marker name changes for those who wanted a gender marker name change. And it's all about strategy. I was helped draft the bill as it came out of the LRGC, and I testified on the bill at committee. And it was how we put the bill in front of committee and in front of the legislature. We were careful on how we branded it. We made clear that this was to decrease the amount of bureaucracy and red tape in our court system and the Department of Corrections. And that was an argument that flew well. It was about speaking the language of the other team. And ultimately, we got the bill passed. It was signed by the governor. There are very specific ways that we can maneuver in systems that appear to be completely stacked against us. I want everyone to remember, you always have a voice when you have a seat at the table. That's why I'm running.
Thank you. Our next question is about getting up to speed, working in a busy legislature. Mr. Miller, for you, as if you were elected, you would be a new legislator. And being a new legislator requires learning a lot of information in a short amount of time. Talk about the skills and abilities you have to help you do that and hit the ground running in our legislature.
I appreciate that question too. I have a lot of advantages that I'm looking forward to taking advantage of. Given that we have no general election challenger, after June, I will start getting involved with all of my colleagues, or incoming colleagues I'll have up on Capitol Hill. I'm glad to say that I have a lot of friendships with current sitting legislators and over here at City Hall to try and be effective. I'm an attorney. I understand how the law works. I'd be one of the few legislators that studied legislative drafting and statutory interpretation in law school. When I was in law school, I interned with the Utah State Senate under Jim Backus. So I'm familiar with the ways that the Utah State Legislature operates. I know quite a few people. I need to know quite a few more, but I'm not going to waste any time doing that. I'm going to hit the ground running as soon as the primary election is over.
Thank you. Representative Briscoe, as the incumbent, you already are well aware of the challenges that a Democrat in the legislature faces advocating for constituents. Would your playbook change in 2024, 2025? What would you do differently? What would you do the same to continue being an effective legislator?
What you can control is what you do. You can't control. I frankly hope some of the incumbents lose. I frankly hope some of the challengers win. But we won't really know that till November or a little bit after November. After that, the other thing we don't know is who the committee chairs will be and who the speaker will appoint to be the committee chairs, and that can always change the dynamics of any given committee. Of course, during the legislative session, you don't always know exactly what committee your bill might be kicked out to. Excuse me. What you can control is how well you prepare. I got a program created, a 3-year pilot program to provide zero fare, no fare UTA transit on really bad inversion days in the winter. I might have had 10 to 15 meetings. I did it very carefully and systematically. I started first, I think I started with the Division of Air Quality, or I started with a scientist at the University of Utah who directed me to another person. I went to DAQ, who directed me to the director of the Division of Environmental Quality, which led to a meeting with their scientist. He said, well, how come you don't expand the bill to do this? I said, let's just deal with the winter first before we work on summer ozone. Then I met with the UTA. It's very systematic. You have to bring a lot of people on board. Some bills are more complex than others. The bill I wrote, which would have charged, put a $10 carbon tax, I spent a year on and did at least 2 different versions in 2 years.
Thank you. Now let's move into some issues. We'll start with education, and so Representative Briscoe, as you brought that up, we're gonna come back to you. We'll start with you. In 2022, only 37% of Utah students met the National Assessment for Educational Progress's proficiency level in reading. The Early Literacy Outcomes Improvement Bill that passed that year aims to get the percentage of Utah third graders reading on a grade level up to 70% by 2027. So far, that percentage has only gone up 2%. We're at 48%. What plans do you have to support students to help increase the number of these Utah students who are reading at their grade level?
I'm going to ask you to go back and repeat some information. What was the year for the 37% that you began with?
Yes, so that was in 2022. And then in that same year, the legislature passed its Early Literacy Outcomes Improvement Bill, setting the goal of 70% reading of third graders, reading at grade level by 2027. We are at 48.
Well, the first thing to note is you said the year 2020. Within like a week or two, every teacher was teaching in the state of Utah went from teaching in the classroom to teaching via Zoom. I got on a couple of classroom calls. I asked the school district if I could look in on a couple of classrooms. I mean, almost anything that happened in 2020, 2021, you almost have to put an asterisk by because, and right now we're struggling with getting kids back to school and simply coming to attend. One of the reasons why I'm pushing a program to expand UTA's free fare program from beyond Salt Lake City so that students in the Wasatch Front have access to UTA fares and their teachers and their parents and students and the staff members of the schools and make it easier for them to get to school. Make it easier for them to get to school. We know from research that there are certain programs that are better designed to help students read than others. My sister who's in the audience has complained, I think accurately, that she'll be responsible for all the students who are in her classroom, but don't make me responsible for students who don't come. Don't make me responsible for students who miss 25 days of the school year and at the end of the year say, well, you didn't teach this kid and this kid didn't reach competency. I mean, we need some accountability on the part of parents. We need a school system that doesn't say you can cut. We need to work carefully with our communities, with our neighborhoods, with our schools to get kids to come so we can teach them. We also need to use the right programs and the right educational teaching strategies.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, for you, how would you help support Utah students in increasing our reading proficiency in our elementary schools?
Literacy is critical. When I was a younger public defender, I remember the court would give my clients a whole bunch of forms to read. They would just look at it with a blank stare and realized that a lot of them were not literate. A lot of them wind up in the criminal justice system as a result, in a direct nexus of their lack of education. A lot of people wind up in the criminal justice system dropping out of high school, middle school, or earlier, and that leads into literacy. And so I think there's an intersectionality between broader issues and specifically literacy. So to answer the policy question, what should the legislature do? For one, we need to start making education as a profession a livable profession. We need to pay teachers a livable wage. We can't have glass ceilings where people can no longer afford to be an educator. And I believe we can accomplish this by refusing to siphon money away from the public education system and into vouchers. Each year, the state legislature asks for more and more of a fiscal note to put into the private sector. It is a classic tactic that Republicans like to use. We're going to bankrupt a public service and then call it a failure. We need to move against it, and we need to protect our public institutions, help our teachers, make teachers a noble, pay teachers the equivalency of the noble profession that it is.
Thank you. Another education question. This legislative session, Utah stripped DEI efforts from public education, meaning programs related to diversity, equity, and inclusion are no longer permitted. Changes in Utah universities are already underway as DEI efforts have been replaced with a new rule called equal opportunity in education. Under these circumstances, how can Utah support diverse communities, promote inclusion, and protect students and employers who would otherwise benefit from these policies and programs? Mr. Miller, we'll come back to you.
Yes, thank you. I think it's terribly unfortunate that the Utah State Legislature thinks that we shouldn't have programs that support diversity, equity, and inclusions. Well, one of the great shames of the bill that was passed, it claimed to be equal opportunity, but you don't create equal opportunity until you find the people who don't have opportunity and elevate them. And these tend to be people in vulnerable situations and marginalized groups. What is really unfortunate is that this effectively didn't change anything. These offices still exist in universities. It's just that everyone had to go to a thesaurus and find some other words to describe these offices, because evidently diversity, equity, and inclusion are bad words in our lexicon now, and I think that's inappropriate. DEI matters. For me, I didn't know that a person from a minority group who's a public defender could run for public office until in law school I met someone who accomplished that. Recently, I spoke up at Utah State University at a Palestine Solidarity rally, and after the rally, I spoke with some Palestinian students who also didn't know that Palestinian Americans could successfully run for public office, to become attorneys and work in the public interest. If we want equal opportunity for everyone, it comes through diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's about sending the elevator back down and helping people back up. We need to bring the programs back and call them what they are.
Thank you. Representative Briscoe.
I need to correct one statement by my opponent. Some universities have dismantled their DEI programs. The University of Utah has changed the names. There are some universities that have dismantled them. They've set up another office and called it Opportunity for All or something, but it's not designed to do what they're originally designed to do, which is to serve people who don't have privilege like me, who are not white males. Here's the problem. I want to live in a United States of America that is post-racial, in which race doesn't matter. Guess what? Race matters. In this state, I know someone whose friend driving home, a black man was pulled over by a white police officer and told when he rolled down his window and asked the officer what was wrong, "You don't look like you should be driving a car this nice." My family came to America in the 1850s. My wife's family came from Germany in the 1920s. My daughter-in-law's family came from El Salvador in the 1980s. My daughter-in-law was born in the United States and tells me about what it's like to be told to go home to Mexico. And when she flew to Dallas, Texas, 5 years ago, while Trump was in office, with my 2 little grandkids, she almost didn't get on the plane because they told her she was trafficking them. Sometimes you don't get opportunities because of the color of your skin, and it happens in the state of Utah.
Thank you. And our final education question. This year, the legislature also made it easier for book bans in public school libraries to extend statewide. Most of the books that have been banned or challenged deal with concepts such as gender, sexuality, and race. Supporters say these are not bans, but limits on age-appropriate materials in school libraries. What do you see as the next steps for book restricting legislation in the state of Utah? Are there situations where you see reason behind these efforts, or is this an issue that you're simply prepared to confront? And we'll come back to Mr. Miller to start.
I think that we are currently at an inflection point where free speech is under quite a bit of attack, specifically here in the state of Utah. When it comes to book banning, there's a common theme with all of these books. They tend to be values, or purport to have values that are progressive or liberal, or just espouse to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we we're just talking about. I want to quote President Eisenhower during McCarthyism. McCarthy was banning books in embassies in foreign countries, and President Eisenhower called him out. He said, "Don't be afraid to go into the library and read every book." It's about open-mindedness. I mean, that's what it means to be American, is the sharing of values and ideas. If what our system of political discourse is correct, we should be able to challenge it, not shudder away from it, not be scared of it. I don't think that book banning is going away. I think they're going to make it easier and easier to remove books from libraries until there really isn't anything to have meaningful discourse. And it goes beyond books. I'm worried about how universities are treating students who are protesting. Just a few weeks ago, Palestinian solidarity protesters at the University of Utah were shot by rubber bullets. They were met with police violence. 19 of them arrested, including an attorney that was there as a legal supervisor. And that came just hours after they initiated the protest. This is a mass chilling of free speech, and it's happening across our educational institutions.
Representative Briscoe.
Can we ban a phrase? Can we ban the Utah way? You know what the Utah way is? It's the Alabama way. It's the Texas way. It's the Florida way, but we put this big grin on our face because we're so happy. Do you know how many states have banned more books than Utah? Texas, Florida, Missouri. We are number 4. I am not proud. I am not proud. I'm more concerned that kids are not reading books. I want kids to read books. No kid is going to check a book out of the library about a boy that has 2 moms or 2 daddies and decide that he is lesbian or gay. Okay? It's not going to happen. All right? There are some books that probably should be restricted to certain age levels. I read a book that had a sex scene in it. Leon Uris, Mila 18 in 8th grade. Parents had to sign. My dad was a history teacher, books all over the house. And when I was in 8th grade, I was probably really excited about that scene. You know what I remember about that book today? I remember this incredible story of Jews held out against the Nazi Wehrmacht for weeks, for months. That they crushed the entire country of Poland, but they couldn't crush this group of people fighting back Panzer tanks with Molotov cocktails and some rifles and some guns. I think I got out of that book what my teacher wanted me in a world geography class to get out of the book, was learning about an important piece of world history, was learning about a very important world event. And that's why we had kids read books about other things that they don't know personally about.
Thank you to our candidates for that discussion on education. We're going to move now to some questions on Utah's environment. The dying Great Salt Lake is something that we must seriously address before life as we know it on the Wasatch Front is blown away in a toxic dust storm. Water levels are still below what is considered healthy for the lake, but some Utahns seem ready to declare mission accomplished. What do you think is the most important factor that needs to be addressed when it comes to water levels with the Great Salt Lake? What would you do to address that in the Utah legislature? And we'll start with Representative Briscoe.
Is anyone here from the media, could we suggest that all our weathermen, when they show a map of the Great Salt Lake, shrink it to its current size so that they see what it actually looks like? The climate scientists at Utah State University told us 2 years ago that we were going to be in for a wet cycle of 2 to 3 years. We're in year 2. Maybe we get wet next year. We are in a long-term dry cycle. So we have one big problem, and that is we use property taxes to sustain the cost of water. So people don't always see the full cost of water. I mean, I've heard of people who are paying, some cities have upped the cost of water and they're paying $500 or $600 a month to keep their lawns looking like they live in Portland or Seattle. Well, we don't live in Portland or Seattle, and people ought to pay the full cost. And if you're paying $500 a month for water, then just put on your big boy pants and suck it up and pay the $500, or else realize maybe the city's trying to send you a message that maybe we should xeriscape and we should grow these landscapes that look like the place we live in. I think we need stronger action from the governor. I think we need stronger action from the legislature. I think we should act a little bit like our hair's on fire, because the scientist at the U of U got on his bike and did hundreds of samples for arsenic, found them across the entire exposed lake bed, not in just one specific area.
Thank you. We'll move to Mr. Miller for what do we do about the Great Salt Lake?
No, I agree. When we look at the Great Salt Lake, we need to be looking at it as it is. I've got a friend that's got a sailboat at the marina, the Great Salt Lake, and back in 2020, we went for a really sad last sail because the harbor master had said after this, the marina's probably going to dry up. And he's actually over here. It's his boat. And to get out of the mouth of the marina, the water was so low that we all had to grab the mast and pull it to one side so that way the keel could scrape through. And after that, the lake kept drying and drying until halfway through 2020, I was able to walk down the ramp onto the marina where there was once boats, where there was once water. We are now at a point where we have an opportunity. There's some water in the lake. It's still about 5 feet below where average typically is. But if we start using water the way that we ought to, we can preserve this treasure of the American West. We can preserve life on the Wasatch Front. But this involves being water-wise with high elevation desert agriculture, landscaping, and all forms of life. Las Vegas is a gold standard on water reclamation. That entire city is impossible but for water reclamation and the way that they use water from Lake Mead. We need to be replicating that. We need to use water-wise irrigation methods. We're not the only ones in high elevation desert or a desert, and we can do it, but we need to take advantage of it now.
Thank you. Now to air quality, also a huge problem in our state that negatively affects the health of Utahns. The EPA has been releasing stricter air quality standards. Governor Spencer Cox and others in the legislature have called some of these new regulations onerous and said that Utah will not be able to meet them. What are your thoughts on Utah's approach to federal air quality standards, meeting those standards, and can Utah improve its compliance with the EPA's air quality regulations? And we will start back with Mr. Miller.
Thank you. I don't think that it's the state of Utah can't meet them. I think that it's that the state of Utah thinks it's difficult to meet them. I think at the end of the day, it's a matter of capital. Oregon has taken significant strides towards green renewable energy, but we're all part of the same grid here. We use Rocky Mountain Power, which is an organization that provides power across 6 or 7 American states. That includes parts of California. And that all goes in the same grid. When you turn on your lights, you don't necessarily get to choose whether your power comes from windmills in Wyoming or coal power plants in Utah. And so what we have to do is make capital work for it. I mean, Utah, Rocky Mountain Power is going to do what makes fiscal sense. There's a lot of people that work in utilities. They need jobs and the infrastructure's there, and there's a lot of political motivation to protect those jobs at the expense of environmental progress. The trick is meeting that balance in the transition. We can't be dragging our feet in transitionary goals. I hope that Salt Lake City stays on target for its 2030 renewable schedule. And the rest of the state of Utah needs to set affirmative and permanent timetables so that way our private partners can keep up and make sure that these transitions happen, jobs are preserved, and that we have renewable energy and clean air.
Representative Briscoe.
In order to correct a couple of things, Pacific Core is 2 regions. The West Coast Pacific Core, which is principally moving by 2030 to no coal-fired power, no fossil fuel power. The East side Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, which is becoming more and more, actually Wyoming has an enormous amount of wind. And to give you some correct information, 1 year ago, Rocky Mountain Power said, we're gonna retire our 2 Emory County coal-fired power plants in 2032. This year they backed up and said, no, we're gonna keep them burning for another 10 years. So what that means is, people whose lives are damaged, like my wife's lungs, asthma, and anyone who has COPD, more people are gonna die in the Intermountain West in the next 10 years because the air quality is not gonna be as good, as fast. And part of this is because of wildfires in Oregon, which PacifiCorp is liable for up to $1 billion and maybe more. And what you and I should have been doing is paying 1 or 2 cents more per year per kilowatt hour for the last 10 or 20 years, so we could have built better utility lines that were less susceptible to this kind of problem. But we want cheap, and I'm definitely opposed to the governor signing on and saying we can't meet those standards. The reason we have clean air is because of the Clean Air Act. It's because the EPA and the federal government said, you will do this. The reason we have cleaner cars is because the federal government said, you will have cleaner cars. We need to recognize that fact and we need to support it.
Thank you. We're going to talk now about housing issues. We know that Utah is growing and we know that it's growing fast. A report from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development found that the number of people in Utah experiencing homelessness increased by about 4% from 2022 to 2023. Homeless shelters statewide are perpetually at or near capacity, and there are more people on the streets than ever. What do you think is the number one thing that needs to be changed when it comes to the way that Utah is currently dealing with homelessness issues? We'll go back to Representative Briscoe and start with you.
I looked online today. Governor Newsom, California, just signed a $22 billion bill. They say it's going to build 84,000 housing units, 44,000 units for people in moderate to low-income housing. When you talk about housing, we look at the average area median income. I looked up the area median income for my home, and I tried several different locations in District 24. Same. Area median income in this district is $115,400. At 30%, that's $34,000. If you're only going to pay 30% of your income and you're making less than $35,000 a year, that's $900 a month. Anybody know a $900 a month apartment? And I learned from a community council meeting a couple of months ago, in the state of Utah, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, what do we call the very smallest unit? 60% of all the studio apartments in the state of Utah are in Salt Lake City. Why do we close schools? Because we don't build 3-bedroom stuff and 4-bedroom stuff, and people don't move. So we need to build them. I'm chairing a committee for the housing affordability, the State Housing Affordability Committee, on providing homes for people less than 30%. It's his turn.
Mr. Miller, I hear it's your turn.
I could go on.
Warrants going on, actually. Affordable housing isn't one question. There are so many different components to affordable housing. When I think of the umbrella term affordable housing, I first think about unsheltered individuals that need transitioning housing, temporary housing, to get into stabilization. Then I also think about renters. Renters' rights, what people need to be successful in paying rent, to avoid evictions, and to otherwise find places that they could viably rent. And finally, I think about entry into the real estate market for first-time home buyers. All these three things are distinctly complicated issues that I really can't dive into in about 90 seconds. But I will say this, we do have the power to be better with our homelessness resources and transitionary housing. When it comes to renters' rights, the pendulum has swung pretty radically far to one side. And I think that we can distinguish between corporate landlords and community landlords. And I think that the way that we give renter aid can help if we distinguish those two and create programs to keep people in housing. It's a lot easier to keep someone renting a place in that apartment than it is to find them a new apartment. And the same is true for those people, because you got to get deposit. It's really difficult when you get further and further into the hole. As for the real estate market, I fear for the next generation. I don't know how they're going to purchase real estate. It needs immediate and direct confrontation. Unfortunately, I'm out of time, but I hope to resume this question in a moment.
I do want to continue talking for another moment about housing, and also to specifically talk about the homelessness issues. Let's focus on homelessness for a moment, since you've had a moment with affordable housing, and we'll come back to Mr. Miller. Do you have any specific plans or proposals related to increasing shelter or services for people experiencing homelessness?
Thank you. Yes. As a public defender, I'm appointed counsel on cases of people who can't afford an attorney. So many of my clients, if not most, are living in unsheltered conditions, whether that's couch surfing, living in a car, or just in a park or a tent trying to survive. What I started doing in my practice was trying to focus on the social work aspect. When people leave incarceration, they need some place to transition into. We can't just be moving people around from the park, from the sidewalk, into the jail for a week and then back into the park or the sidewalk. We need to start building structure for people who don't have structure. The problem is this, that transitioning people into substance abuse treatment programs, mental health treatment programs. But substance abuse programs often take up to 2 months to gain entry to from the county jail. As for mental health resources, the wait list right now is 18 months. My hope is to help resource these as transitional options and expand and work with our community partners.
Thank you. Representative Briscoe, what would you do to increase shelter and services for people experiencing homelessness?
We just barely started as a state. We're starting to scratch the surface. We're not anywhere near where we need to be. As a person who taught the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Constitution says absolutely nothing about public education. But today we say, every state of the union says we're going to give an education to kids, a basic education. We hope a good one up to 18. I think it's time to start having this dialogue. Everyone deserves a basic place to live. What we do today in the United States of America is we give billions of dollars to people who can afford homes, and we give them lots of tax rebates and tax cuts. And then we gripe and moan and complain when we give a few $1 million to help people get off the street. And they need all kinds of wraparound services. One of the reasons why we're struggling with the criminal system is because we've reduced, we've said, look, we need to reform sentencing, but we haven't increased the Medicaid funding to provide all the services to help the people who need that help. You can't do part of the equation and not do the rest of it and say the system failed if you never tried it.
Thank you. I do want to take a moment to make sure we talk about criminal justice issues in the state, and we'll start with Mr. Miller for this question. In the most recent legislative session, lawmakers passed numerous laws that created new criminal offenses in the state, expanded on existing criminal offenses, and increased penalties. Several of these laws required incarceration. What is the biggest challenge you see in Utah's criminal justice system, and is incarceration an answer?
No. I mean, we as a state keep going back to incarceration as this hammer for every nail. What everyone sort of needs to digest, particularly on the state legislature, is that incarceration is not permanent. As much as it's cruel, it's not permanent. Even people who go down to the prison, the Board of Pardon and Parole has a matrix. They run these calculations to give you a number of how much time you got to serve at the prison, how much trauma you need to endure at the prison before you're released back into society. Well, that's not rehabilitative at all. If someone's going to be released back into society at some point, they need to have the tools and resources to be a productive member of society, not be trained in this gladiator-esque chamber that is our prison system. In each legislative session, the legislature has this one-way ratchet where they take things that are already illegal and they maximize penalties without getting to the root of the problem, without identifying lack of education opportunities, lack of opportunities to get out of poverty. These are the tools that we need to address our failing criminal justice system. not incarceration. You can't incarcerate yourself out of any problem. You can't brutalize people out of any problem. You can't put them in a cage and expect them to go away. Treat a person like a person, and they'll be a person.
Thank you. Representative Briscoe, what do you have to say about criminal justice issues in Utah?
One of the things we could look at, and maybe we should spend some time looking at, is risk-based sentencing. We don't have a very supple or nimble sentencing guidelines. There could be two individuals who both might be guilty of a second-degree felony, but one person could be at much greater risk of reoffending or being a danger to the community than the other, but we treat them the same. We shouldn't be treating them the same. We should be looking at every opportunity we can to help rehabilitate people without putting them behind bars. There's another thing that has to be talked about. We may not have chattel slavery today, but across the United States, we put far more people of color, especially black men, in prison. We are filling the jails, and I don't see why we're filling the jails with all the people we're filling jails with. As a person who worked with people who will call me and say, can you help me with my rent? I just got out of jail. I had a whole series of questions I asked them about whether they had a drug abuse issue, what their drug of choice was, whether or not they had a program. And I am not impressed with the supports we give people who are just out of jail, just out of prison. And then we complain when they go back in. I remember meeting with a probation officer and a young man, and I thought the probation officer, given his workload, was doing as good a job as he could. You know, we don't value people in the state of Utah. We just don't provide the resources to people that we should, which could help people in the long run be successful.
And looking at the time, I anticipate this is going to be our final question. Is that right? So let's turn to healthcare. At the moment, abortion in Utah remains legal up to 18 weeks as we await a ruling from the Utah Supreme Court on the state's trigger ban and restrictions on abortions performed in clinics. If these bans take effect, what actions could potentially be taken to support Utahns in need of abortion care? Do you support working with Republicans to possibly create a compromise and find some solutions on abortion policy if the Supreme Court puts us in a situation where the bans go into effect? And we'll start with Representative Briscoe.
Maybe compromise, it depends on the compromise. I can't agree to a compromise that I haven't seen the language. But our trigger ban's a disaster. It defines life as implantation. When a fertilized egg gets attached to the wall of the uterus, it's a life. I'm not a theologian, but I find that ludicrous, and it leads to the problems that they had in Alabama, where you say this very small, not many celled organism gets protections of life. The exceptions for health of the mother, rape, and incest require all kinds of documentation that doesn't happen in real life. Sometimes the incestee is living with the incestor. Sometimes the person who made that young woman pregnant is living in the house with them, and you're expecting them to come forward? I mean, that's just crazy talk. That just means you haven't really understood. What can we do? There are states that help women get to other states. Can we compromise? We could try, but I gotta see it. And I know some of the people who wrote this legislation are not really optimistic about, compromising with them, but it's always worth the talk, right? And we haven't seen what the Supreme Court has come down with yet. The Utah Supreme Court, they're working on something. Maybe they'll open some avenues that we can explore. But this is going to devastate. I mean, I spoke to a woman who's an OBGYN up at the U. And I told her, you're still hanging on. And she said, yeah. But will she want to hang on in the state of Utah? Or will she be like the OBGYNs in Idaho who will flee for Colorado and Oregon and Washington and California?
Thank you. Mr. Miller?
I am very concerned about the trajectory that we have for abortion care and health care related to childbearing and women's rights in general. The trigger ban, yes, is still paused post-Dobbs. The state Supreme Court, though, any day, literally any day, could unpause that stay. And just like that overnight, we would not have access to abortion health care in this state. The next closest abortion health care clinic is in Glenwood, Colorado, and after that is Las Vegas, Nevada. We need to do everything we can to try to begin the battle to restore health care and abortion care and restore reproductive health care. the legislature is, once again, the one-way ratchet. They're using criminalization as a weapon here. Representative Briscoe talked about all of the obstetricians that fled Idaho. About a quarter of Idaho's gynecological obstetricians left Idaho because they had the same kind of criminal mechanism that Utah has proposed, which is the Attorney General, or likely the Attorney General, would make a charging decision charging that doctor with a second-degree felony if they performed what they thought was an unlawful abortion. Now, that's a 15-year prison sentence. Who would want to practice in those circumstances where you had to choose between saving someone's life or potentially going to prison? What's more, it makes it a healthcare island. People could leave, people could die, and we need to reverse course the best that we can.
Thank you to our candidates. It's time for our closing statements, and it's Mr. Miller's turn to go first.
Thank you. Once again, my name is Grant Umjud Miller. As I've mentioned several times today, I'm a public defender. Became a public defender because I wanted to help people in difficult circumstances, and that translates to why I'm running for the Utah State Legislature. Now, I want to answer a question that I think a lot of you are asking now. After listening to a debate, you've discovered that me and Representative Briscoe have very similar ideologies. So why am I running? And I'll tell you this. I believe that this race isn't self-contained. I think every political race, particularly if it's a Democratic race here in Salt Lake County, is part of a larger marathon of progressing our progressive and liberal values. Representative Briscoe has served this district well for about 14 years. I am ready at the new leg of the race to receive the baton. I've got a fresh pair of legs. I'm eager to bring a new thought process, a new approach, new strategies, and a fresh energy to the Utah State Legislature. I will do my best by it. I'm not claiming that I can save the world, but I picked up a lot of skills in the courtroom that I think are going to translate quite well. I'm excited for what can happen in this community in the long term, and I ask for this opportunity. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to earning your vote this week and at the ballot box on June 25th. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Briscoe, your closing statement. We'll applaud at the end, don't worry.
It's been a great honor to be a representative in the Utah House of Representatives. It can be the people's house if we'll make it the people's house instead of the house of corporate interests and people who are afraid and people who are scared of change and Utah becoming more diverse. I can make you some promises. I can tell you what I will do. I will continue to be appalled at banning school and library books, and I will work against. I will continue to push back against the big election lie, and I will continue to work to expand the franchise so more people can vote. I am disgusted at the legislature becoming the bathroom nanny. I will fight against efforts to take away vote by mail and ranked choice voting. We cannot save the Great Salt Lake and also dam the Bear River. One has to go. Our water conservation goals are weak and need to be strengthened. Clean air. The incremental steps that we've accomplished have helped some, but they are not enough. We need stronger commitments and more action. Democracy is at stake. The long-term health and vitality of the Wasatch Fund and the state of Utah is at stake. I have constituents who are starting to talk with their significant others about when they sell their homes, when do we give the how much time do we give the state to see whether they're really going to fulfill their promises on the Great Salt Lake. Arizona is putting $800 million into vouchers. At one point this year, they tried to put $200 million into vouchers and settled on 82 in this state. You know where they want to go. You know what they want to do. They are taking down and dramatically weakening public education. The legislature has a lot of attorneys. The legislature has a lot of developers. The legislature has a lot of businessmen. The legislature does not have a lot of teachers. The entire teacher caucus within the Utah House of Representatives is with you tonight. It's 2 individuals. There's 1 in the Utah State Senate. This past year, the legislature sponsored 179 bills dealing with public education that were tracked by the state office. I think it's important that we keep a teacher me, in District 24, on the Hill, keeping track of that legislation. I also serve on the Public Ed Appropriations Committee, where we help put together the budget for public education. The biggest budget, billions of dollars of state and federal money. I've been on the committee for 12 years. I know it front and back. You can't learn that stuff easily. I've loved the opportunity to be in the dialogue and be in the discussion. I ask the citizens who will vote for 2 more years. Thank you for coming tonight and for listening in.
Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight to hear from the Democrats running to represent Utah Legislature's House District 24. Mail-in ballots are coming your way soon. We invite you to vote in the state's primary election on June 24th. Thank you for coming tonight.